The cemetery lay shrouded in morning mist, where weathered wooden crosses stood like silent sentinels against the pale Texas sky. Elena Blackwood knelt beside a simple grave marked only with Maria Esperanza, Madre Querida, her fingers tracing the carved letters with reverent precision. The wildflowers she had brought, desert marigolds and purple sage, seemed to glow against the dark earth, their colors speaking the words her voice could not. She had not spoken aloud in 13 years. The wind carried whispers across the cemetery, stirring memories like autumn leaves. In her mind she could still hear Maria's voice, warm as honey and soft as prayer. "Mija, your silence is not weakness. It is the deepest kind of strength, the kind that listens to what others cannot hear." Elena's fingers moved to the leather journal at her side, its pages filled with sketches and words in Spanish, the language of her heart, though she had been forbidden to speak it aloud since Maria's death 6 months ago. She opened to a fresh page and began to draw. Maria's gentle hands braiding her hair, the morning light filtering through their small kitchen window, the way her foster mother's eyes crinkled when she smiled. But as her charcoal moved across the paper, darker images began to emerge, the shadowy figure of Maxwell Holden looming in doorways, the fear that lived in Maria's eyes during those final months, the strange, bitter smell that had begun to cling to Maria's evening tea. A sound made Elena's hand freeze mid-stroke, footsteps on gravel, deliberate and heavy. She didn't need to look to know who approached. Maxwell's presence carried its own weight, a disturbance in the air that made small creatures flee and flowers wilt. "There you are, girl." His voice scraped like rusted metal. Elena continued drawing, adding shadows to Maria's face, but her body tensed like a deer sensing a predator. "You've been out here since dawn. Time to come home. Got work for you." Home. The word was ash in Elena's mind. The Holden Ranch had never been home. It was a prison disguised as sanctuary, a place where she existed but did not live. Maxwell's boots stopped just behind her shoulder. "I'm talking to you, Elena." She closed her journal slowly, reverently, and rose to her feet without turning around. In her peripheral vision, she caught the flash of sunlight on the silver cross that hung from her neck, Maria's final gift, pressed into her palm during those last fevered hours. "Look at me when I'm speaking to you." Elena turned, but kept her eyes fixed on the middle distance, somewhere beyond Maxwell's left shoulder, where a red-tailed hawk circled against the endless sky. Up close, Maxwell Holden appeared exactly what he claimed to be, a successful rancher in his mid-40s, weathered by sun and wind, his brown hair streaked with premature silver. But Elena had learned to see past surfaces. His eyes held the cold calculation of a snake, and his hands, now clenched at his sides, bore calluses not from honest work, but from gripping reins during midnight rides and handles of weapons that should not exist on a legitimate cattle ranch. "The railroad inspector's coming today," Maxwell continued, his voice carrying that particular edge that meant danger for someone. "Wilson's his name. You'll serve lunch when he arrives, and you'll keep your mouth shut, same as always. But I want you listening, understand? That man's got questions that need careful answers." Elena nodded once, a barely perceptible movement. "Good, and girl," Maxwell stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the tobacco and whiskey on his breath, see the network of broken blood vessels in his nose. "If you ever get ideas about running off like some foolish child, remember what happened to Maria. Remember that accidents happen to people who don't appreciate the good life they've been given." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Elena's fingers tightened around her journal, but her expression remained unchanged, a skill she had perfected over the years. Show nothing, feel everything, survive. Maxwell studied her for a long moment, perhaps searching for cracks in her composure. Finding none, he turned and walked back toward his horse, leaving Elena alone with the dead and the weight of unspoken truths. But he was wrong about one thing. Elena had been listening for years, not just to his words, but to the things he tried to hide. The late-night meetings in the barn, the men who rode in under cover of darkness, the way supply wagons bound for the railroad camps seemed to lose their way with disturbing frequency, and she had been drawing faces, license plates, maps, times and dates. Her journal was not just a collection of memories and dreams, it was evidence, carefully documented in a hand that shook with rage but never wavered in its precision. As Maxwell's hoofbeats faded into the distance, Elena opened her journal once more and began to sketch his face. But beneath his features she drew another image, one that had haunted her dreams for 13 years. A man with kind eyes and gentle hands, speaking to her in rapid Spanish as blood pooled beneath him. Her father, Eduardo Blackwood, the man Maxwell had murdered to claim the land that held secrets worth killing for. The memory was fragmentary, seen through the eyes of a 7-year-old child hidden in a root cellar, but it was enough. She remembered the argument about water rights and mineral claims. She remembered her father's voice, raised in anger for the first time in her young life, speaking of documents that proved the land belonged to Mexican families who had been cheated by American bureaucrats. Most importantly, she remembered Maxwell's face as he pulled the trigger. Elena closed her eyes and let the morning sun warm her face. In a few hours this railroad inspector would arrive, and Maxwell would perform his carefully rehearsed role of the honest rancher plagued by mysterious thefts. But Elena had learned that men like Maxwell always made mistakes when they felt secure, when they believed themselves untouchable. She began walking back toward the ranch, her bare feet silent on the dusty ground. As she crested the small rise that revealed the sprawling collection of buildings Maxwell called his empire, she paused to study the scene with an artist's eye for detail. The main house sat at the center like a spider in its web, its whitewashed walls and red tile roof speaking of prosperity built on blood and lies. To the east, the bunkhouse where Maxwell's hired men slept off their violent labors. To the west, the barn where she was forbidden to go after sunset, when the mysterious meetings took place. And there, barely visible among the cottonwoods that lined the creek, she could see the small adobe house where she had spent the happiest years of her life, Maria's house. The place where she had learned to draw and read, where Spanish lullabies had soothed her nightmares, where love had grown like wildflowers in the desert, unexpected, resilient, and beautiful. The house had been empty since Maria's death, but Elena still slipped away to visit it when Maxwell traveled to town. She had discovered things there. Hidden things that Maria had left for her to find. Letters written in Spanish, tucked behind loose stones in the wall. Maps drawn in Maria's careful hand. And most importantly, a small wooden box containing documents that proved Eduardo Blackwood had been the legal owner of the land Maxwell now claimed. Elena had spent months deciphering the papers, her knowledge of Spanish rusty from years of enforced silence. But the truth was undeniable. Her father had not been a squatter or claim jumper, as Maxwell told anyone who asked. He had been a legitimate landowner, and his murder had been an act of calculated theft. The sound of approaching horses interrupted her thoughts. 3 riders were coming up the main road, dust clouds marking their progress across the valley. Elena's enhanced hearing, sharpened by years of relying on senses other than speech, caught fragments of conversation carried on the wind, official voices, men with badges and authority. The railroad inspector had arrived early. Elena hurried toward the house, her mind already planning. She would need to position herself where she could listen without being seen. The kitchen window, perhaps, or the servants' passage that connected the main house to the cooking areas. Maxwell expected her to serve lunch, but he didn't expect her to understand the true significance of what she overheard. He had always underestimated her. It would be his downfall. As she approached the kitchen door, Elena paused to look back toward the cemetery where Maria lay sleeping. "Today, Mama," she whispered in Spanish, her voice so soft it was barely more than breath. "Today we begin to set things right." The words felt strange on her lips after so many years of silence, but they also felt like coming home. Elena slipped into the kitchen and began preparing for Maxwell's performance, her hands steady as she arranged cups and plates, her mind cataloging every detail she would need to remember. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled across the Texas sky, promising storms to come, but Elena had weathered storms before. She had survived 13 years of enforced silence, of watching justice denied and truth buried. She had endured the slow poisoning of the only person who had ever truly loved her, and she had learned to channel her grief into something harder and more dangerous than Maxwell could imagine. Patience, observation, and when the moment came, precision. The horses drew closer, their riders' voices growing clearer. Elena positioned herself near the kitchen window and opened her journal to a fresh page. Whatever happened in the next few hours, she would be ready to document it. Every word, every gesture, every lie. Maxwell Holden had taught her many things over the years, though not the lessons he intended. He had taught her that the powerful prey on the weak, that authority meant nothing without compassion, and that silence could be the deepest form of strength. But most importantly, he had taught her that every monster eventually makes a mistake. Elena just had to be patient enough to see it when it came. The three riders approached with the unhurried confidence of men who carried federal authority. Elena watched from the kitchen window as they dismounted near the main porch, noting the way their horses showed signs of hard travel. Foam at the bits, dust caked on their flanks, the weary set of their heads that spoke of many miles covered at speed. The lead rider was younger than she had expected, perhaps in his late 20s, with dark hair and the lean build of a man who lived in the saddle. There was something familiar about the set of his shoulders, the way he moved with unconscious grace despite obvious fatigue. As he turned to survey the ranch, Elena caught sight of his profile and felt her heart stutter. The shape of his nose, the angle of his jaw, the way his hand moved to adjust his hat, all echoes of the man in her fragmentary memories, the man who had spoken to her in Spanish as his life bled away. This railroad inspector looked like her father. Elena's charcoal snapped between suddenly nerveless fingers. Impossible. Eduardo Blackwood had died 13 years ago, his body buried in an unmarked grave somewhere on Maxwell's property, but the resemblance was uncanny, as if time had somehow reached back to restore what had been lost. Maxwell emerged from the house, already wearing his mask of rural hospitality. Elena had watched him perfect this performance over the years. The slight stoop to appear less threatening, the carefully modulated voice that suggested humble respectability, the way he kept his hands visible and empty to project trustworthiness. "Gentlemen," Maxwell called out, striding toward the riders with his arms spread wide, "welcome to the Holden Ranch. You must be the railroad inspectors we've been expecting." The young man who looked like her father stepped forward, removing his hat with practiced courtesy. "Diego Wilson, Texas Central Railroad. These are my associates Marshall Tucker and Inspector Hayes. We appreciate you taking the time to meet with us, Mr. Holden." Diego Wilson. The name meant nothing to Elena, but something about his voice, the careful pronunciation, the slight accent that he almost successfully concealed, sent recognition flooding through her like ice water. She had heard that voice before, younger and higher, calling her name in the moments before their world ended. "Diego," she breathed, the word barely audible even to herself. He had survived. Somehow, impossibly, her brother had survived and grown into this stranger with a borrowed name and federal credentials. But why hadn't he come for her? Why had he left her to endure 13 years of Maxwell's cruelty while he built a new life? Elena's hand moved automatically to her journal, but she found herself unable to draw or write. Her mind was reeling, trying to process the implications of what she was seeing. If Diego was alive, if he had become a railroad inspector, then perhaps his presence here was not coincidence. Perhaps he had come looking for her, for the truth, for justice at last. "Please come inside," Maxwell was saying, his voice warm with false sincerity. "My girl will have lunch ready shortly, and we can discuss your concerns in comfort." Elena watched as the three men followed Maxwell toward the house, noting the way Diego's eyes moved constantly, cataloging details with the attention of a man who expected danger. His gaze swept past the kitchen window where she stood, and for one heart-stopping moment their eyes met. He froze mid-step, his face going pale beneath its tan. Elena saw recognition dawn in his eyes, not of who she had become, but of who she had been. The little sister he had lost, now grown into a woman but still bearing the unmistakable features of their shared heritage. "Sir?" Marshall Tucker's voice broke the spell. "Is something wrong?" Diego blinked, seeming to gather himself with visible effort. "Nothing, just admiring the architecture, beautiful stonework." But his eyes remained fixed on the window where Elena stood, and she saw questions there, and pain, and something that might have been hope. She raised one hand, barely lifting it from the windowsill, and touched her fingers to her heart. It was a gesture Maria had taught her, a silent way of saying, "I see you, I know you, I love you." Diego's breath caught, and his own hand moved unconsciously to mirror the gesture. Then Maxwell's voice called from the porch, breaking the moment. "Wilson, you coming?" "Yes, sir, my apologies." But as Diego turned to follow the others into the house, Elena saw him mouth a single word. "Elena." She sank against the kitchen wall, her journal clutched to her chest. 13 years of carefully maintained composure finally beginning to crack. Diego was alive. Her brother, older now, changed by years and circumstances she could barely imagine, but undeniably the boy who had once carved wooden horses for her and taught her to braid flowers into chains. The sound of boots on wooden floors snapped her back to the present. Maxwell was leading the inspectors through the main hallway, his voice carrying clearly, as he launched into his prepared speech about the difficulties honest ranchers faced from organized bandits. Elena forced herself to move, to prepare the lunch she had been ordered to serve. But her hands shook as she sliced bread and arranged cold meat on plates, and her mind raced with possibilities and questions. How much did Diego know about what had really happened? Had he seen their father's murder, or had he only arrived to find Elena gone and Eduardo dead? Was his presence here part of some larger plan for justice, or was he simply doing his job, unaware of the connections that bound him to this place? She had no way to communicate with him, not with Maxwell watching every move, but perhaps Elena glanced toward the servants' passage that connected the kitchen to the dining room. If she was careful, if she timed it right, she might be able to slip him a note when she served the meal. Elena tore a small piece of paper from the back of her journal and began to write in Spanish, her handwriting deliberately childish. The way she had written when Diego had taught her letters all those years ago. Diego, soy Elena, tu hermana, Papa fue asesinado por Maxwell. Mamá María murió hace 6 meses. Tengo pruebas. Ten cuidado él es peligroso. No estás solo. Diego, I am Elena, your sister. Papa was murdered by Maxwell. Mama Maria died 6 months ago. I have proof. Be careful, he is dangerous. You are not alone. She folded the note into a tiny square and tucked it under the edge of one of the lunch plates, positioning it so that only Diego would see it when she placed his meal before him. From the dining room, she could hear Maxwell's voice growing more animated as he warmed to his performance. The thing you have to understand, gentlemen, is that these aren't random thefts. There's organization behind them, planning. Someone's been watching the railroad schedules, timing the attacks for maximum impact. Elena paused in her preparations, her enhanced hearing picking up nuances in Maxwell's tone that others might miss. He was telling the truth, but not the whole truth. Yes, someone was watching the schedules and planning the attacks, but that someone was Maxwell himself, along with his network of hired criminals who posed as honest ranch hands. She had spent months learning to read the subtle signs, the way certain men disappeared for days at a time, returning with new money and no explanation of where they had been. The careful timing of Maxwell's own absences, always coinciding with reports of railroad robberies. The maps in his study, marked with routes and schedules that no legitimate rancher would need, but proving it would require more than observations and sketches. Elena needed documents, evidence that would stand up in a federal court. She needed access to Maxwell's private papers, to the correspondence he kept locked in the safe behind his desk. Now I'm not saying I know who's behind these crimes, Maxwell continued, his voice carrying the perfect note of concerned citizenship, but I have my suspicions. There's been talk in town about Mexican gangs operating out of the canyon country to the south, desperate men who see the railroad as an easy target. Elena's hands stilled at the familiar lie. Maxwell had been spreading this story for months, using racial prejudice to deflect suspicion while he robbed trains and murdered witnesses. She had heard him practicing the speech in his study, refining the details to make them sound authentic. Marshall Tucker's voice cut through Maxwell's performance. That's interesting, Mr. Holden. What kind of talk, specifically? Well, nothing concrete, you understand, just rumors. Stories about riders seen in the area before attacks. Dark-skinned men on fast horses, speaking Spanish among themselves. Elena felt sick. She knew what would happen next. Maxwell would offer to guide the inspectors to the canyon country, where they would find carefully planted evidence pointing to Mexican bandits. Perhaps they would even find scapegoats, innocent men paid to be in the wrong place at the right time, or corpses positioned to support Maxwell's narrative. It was a comprehensive plan, years in the making, but it had one flaw Maxwell didn't know about. Elena had been documenting everything, and she had hidden that documentation where he would never think to look. The sound of chairs scraping against wood told her the men were preparing to move to the dining room. Elena picked up the tray of prepared lunches and walked toward the servants in trance, her bare feet silent on the wooden floors. She had served hundreds of meals in this house, but today was different. Today she was not just Maxwell's silent servant. Today, she was Diego's sister, and she carried with her the first piece of communication they had shared in 13 years. Elena pushed through the swinging door into the dining room and set the tray on the sideboard. Maxwell sat at the head of the long table, gesturing expansively as he continued his performance. Diego sat to his right, his posture carefully neutral but his eyes alert. The two federal officers flanked them, notebooks open, pens poised to record whatever truths or lies emerged from the conversation. "Ah, excellent," Maxwell said as Elena began placing plates before each man. "Gentlemen, this is Elena. She's been with our family for years. Quiet girl, but she makes wonderful biscuits." Elena kept her eyes downcast as she moved around the table, playing the role Maxwell expected. But when she reached Diego's place, she allowed her fingers to brush against his as she set down his plate. The contact was brief, barely a second, but she felt him start with recognition. His eyes flicked to hers, then to the plate where the folded note lay hidden beneath the edge. He gave the slightest nod, so subtle that anyone not watching for it would miss the gesture entirely. "The canyon country you mentioned," Inspector Hayes was saying. "How far south are we talking?" Maxwell leaned back in his chair, the picture of a man settling in to share local wisdom. "About 20 miles, maybe 25, rough terrain, lots of places to hide. The Apache used to use those canyons for refuge before they were relocated to the reservations." Elena poured coffee with steady hands, her mind automatically cataloging lies and half-truths. Yes, the canyons were 20 miles south. Yes, they had once sheltered Apache families. But they were also where Maxwell had buried her father, where he had hidden the evidence of his crimes, and where he was planning to lead these federal officers into an ambush that would leave no witnesses to his activities. "We'll want to take a look at that area," Marshal Tucker said. "Would you be willing to guide us?" "Of course," Maxwell replied without hesitation. "Though I'd recommend waiting until morning. Those trails are treacherous in fading light, and there have been more incidents lately. Last week, one of my hands saw smoke signals coming from the canyon rim. Could be nothing but another lie, smoothly delivered." Elena had seen Maxwell's man making those smoke signals himself, part of the elaborate deception being constructed around the federal investigation. As she moved around the table, Elena caught fragments of the conversation, questions about railroad schedules, discussions of security measures, Marshal Tucker's growing interest in the supposed Mexican gang theory. With each lie Maxwell told, each false lead he planted, Elena felt her resolve hardening. For 13 years she had been silent. She had watched and waited, endured and survived, but she had never acted. That was about to change. When she finished serving, Elena retreated to the kitchen but remained within earshot of the dining room. Through the partially open door, she could see Diego surreptitiously palming the note she had left him. His face remained composed, but she noticed the slight tremor in his hand as he tucked the paper into his vest pocket. The conversation continued for another hour, with Maxwell masterfully steering the discussion toward his preferred narrative. He spoke of recent thefts with the wounded authority of a victim, described the supposed Mexican bandits with just enough detail to seem credible, and offered his services as guide and local expert with the humble confidence of a man eager to serve justice. It was a brilliant performance, Elena had to admit. If she hadn't known the truth, she might have believed every word. Finally, the men rose from the table. Maxwell was suggesting they spend the night at his ranch before venturing into the canyon country. Another part of his plan, Elena realized. He would want them comfortable, off guard, trusting in his hospitality before leading them into danger. "That's very generous," Marshal Tucker said, "but we have rooms reserved in town. We'll return first thing in the morning for that guided tour." Elena saw a flicker of annoyance cross Maxwell's face before he smoothed it away. "Of course, though I hope you'll reconsider. My guest rooms are quite comfortable, and it would save you the ride back and forth." "We appreciate the offer," Diego said, his voice carefully neutral. "But we have some reports to review tonight, correspondence to send back to Austin. It's better if we stay in town." Smart, Elena thought. Diego might not know the full extent of Maxwell's plans, but his instincts were telling him to maintain distance and independence. The men moved toward the front of the house, their boots echoing on the wooden floors. Elena slipped through the servants' passage to position herself near the front window, where she could observe their departure without being seen. As the federal officers mounted their horses, Diego glanced toward the house one final time. His eyes found the window where Elena stood, and he touched his hat brim in a gesture that might have looked like simple courtesy to the other men. But Elena saw it for what it was: acknowledgement, connection, and a promise that this was not the end of their communication. Maxwell stood on the porch, playing the role of gracious host to the end. "I'll have my men ready at dawn," he called as the riders turned toward the road. "We'll find these bandits, gentlemen. You can count on that." Elena watched until the dust clouds disappeared over the ridge, then turned away from the window. The house felt different now, charged with new possibilities and dangers. Maxwell would be planning his next moves, preparing for the morning's deception. But Elena had her own preparations to make. She had given Diego the first piece of the puzzle. Now she needed to gather the rest before Maxwell could spring whatever trap he was planning in the canyon country. Elena made her way to her small room at the back of the house, the space she had occupied since Maria's death. It was barely larger than a closet, containing only a narrow bed, a washstand, and a wooden chest for her few belongings. But hidden beneath a loose floorboard under her bed lay her true treasures. Years of documentation, carefully preserved in oiled cloth. She knelt and worked the board free, her fingers finding the familiar bundle. Maps drawn from memory, showing the locations where Maxwell's men met. Sketches of faces, names overheard in whispered conversations, dates and times cross-referenced with newspaper reports of railroad thefts. And most importantly, copies of the documents she had found in Maria's house. Proof of her father's legitimate claim to the land, evidence of the murder Maxwell thought he had buried with his victim. Elena spread the papers across her bed, studying them in the fading afternoon light. She had been collecting evidence for years, but she had never had anyone to share it with. No one who could act on what she had discovered. Now, with Diego's return, everything had changed. But she would need to be careful. Maxwell was suspicious by nature, and paranoid about threats to his carefully constructed empire. If he suspected that Elena was anything more than the silent, broken girl he believed her to be, he would not hesitate to silence her permanently, the same way he had silenced Maria. Elena's fingers moved to the silver cross at her throat, remembering her foster mother's final words. "The truth will not stay buried forever, mija. Someday, someone will come who can help you set things right." That someone had arrived today, wearing Diego's face and carrying federal authority. But Elena had learned long ago that hope could be as dangerous as despair. She would need to be smart, cautious, and above all, patient. The afternoon was fading toward evening, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Soon, Maxwell would expect her to prepare dinner, to serve him and his men as if this had been a day like any other. She would play that role one more time, listening and watching, waiting for her next opportunity to act. Elena carefully returned her evidence to its hiding place and smoothed the floorboard back into position. Whatever happened tomorrow in the canyon country, she would be ready. Diego might not know it yet, but he was no longer alone in his quest for justice. The girl who had watched her father die in silence was gone, replaced by a woman who understood the power of patience, observation, and perfectly timed action. Maxwell Holden had taught her well, though not the lessons he intended. Tomorrow those lessons would finally be turned against him. As darkness fell over the Texas landscape, Elena Blackwood began to prepare for war. The pre-dawn darkness wrapped around Elena like a shroud as she slipped from the main house, her bare feet finding the familiar path to Maria's abandoned home. The air carried the scent of sage and coming rain, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called to its pack. Elena had learned to read these signs. Storms were building on the horizon, both in the sky and in the careful web of deception Maxwell had spent years weaving. She moved like a ghost through the cottonwoods, her white nightgown making her nearly invisible in the dappled moonlight. Years of navigating Maxwell's domain in silence had taught her which boards creaked, which paths held the firmest footing, which shadows offered the deepest concealment. Maria's house stood empty and dark, but Elena could still feel the warmth that had once lived within its adobe walls. She slipped through the rear door, never locked, for who would steal from the dead, and made her way to the small altar where Maria had kept her most precious possessions. The statue of the Virgin of Guadalupe stood exactly as Elena had left it 6 months ago, her painted robes faded, but her expression still radiating the compassion that had drawn Maria to her prayers each evening. Elena lifted the statue with reverent hands, feeling for the hidden mechanism Maria had shown her during those final fevered days. A gentle press at the base, and the statue's hollow interior revealed its secret. A rolled parchment, yellowed with age and written in Maria's careful Spanish script. "Para mi querida Elena," the letter began. "If you are reading this, then God has called me home, and you are alone with the truth we both carry." Elena's eyes filled as she read the words Maria had written during her final illness, when the poison Maxwell fed her had made her too weak to speak, but her mind remained sharp as obsidian. "Your father Eduardo was not the simple farmer Maxwell claims. He was educated, trained as an engineer in Mexico City before the troubles drove him north. The land Maxwell stole contains more than fertile soil. Beneath the southern ridge lies a vein of silver so pure the Apache called it Tears of the Moon. Eduardo discovered this when he was surveying for irrigation channels. He told only me, and we agreed to keep the secret until you were old enough to understand its value." Elena's hands trembled as she absorbed this revelation. Everything Maxwell had done, the murder, the theft of land, the systematic destruction of Eduardo's identity, had been motivated not just by greed for property, but by knowledge of the treasure hidden beneath it. "I have hidden the original survey maps Eduardo made, along with his mining certificates and the legal documents proving his ownership. They are in the old well behind this house, wrapped in oiled leather and weighted with stones. Maxwell searches for them still, though he does not know exactly what he seeks. This is why he kept you alive, mija. He believes Eduardo may have told you where these papers are hidden." Elena's breath caught. Maxwell's occasional questions, his seemingly casual inquiries about her father's habits and hiding places, suddenly made terrible sense. He had been interrogating her for years, so subtly she had never recognized the purpose. "But there is more you must know, and this will hurt your heart as it has broken mine. Maxwell did not act alone in Eduardo's murder. He had help from someone you trusted, someone we both loved. Your brother Diego was not the innocent child we believed him to be." The letter fell from Elena's nerveless fingers. No, Maria had to be wrong about this. Diego had returned as a federal officer, seeking justice. He was her salvation, not another source of betrayal. Elena forced herself to continue reading. Though each word felt like a dagger thrust, Diego had been meeting secretly with Maxwell for weeks before your father's death. I saw them together by the creek, arguing in whispers. I heard Diego telling Maxwell about Eduardo's discovery, about the silver hidden in the southern ridge. Your brother was only 15, mija, but he was angry about being poor, resentful that Eduardo refused to mine the silver and make them rich. Maxwell promised Diego wealth and position if he would help, and your brother's greed overcame his love for family. Elena sank to her knees before the altar. Maria's letter clutched against her chest. The recognition scene she had witnessed yesterday, the careful way Diego had acknowledged her. What if it hadn't been brotherly love and concern? What if it had been guilt and calculation? On the night Eduardo died, Diego led him into Maxwell's trap. Your father trusted his son completely, never suspecting betrayal until Maxwell's knife found his heart. Diego was supposed to kill you too, to eliminate all witnesses. But when the moment came, he could not do it. Instead, he ran. Maxwell told everyone the boy had been murdered alongside his father, but I knew better. I had seen Diego counting the gold Maxwell gave him. Elena's carefully constructed world crashed around her like a house built on sand. The brother she had mourned for 13 years, the family member whose return had filled her with desperate hope, was nothing more than another predator drawn by the scent of her vulnerability. But Maria's letter was not finished. I tell you this not to destroy your hope, but to arm you with truth. Diego has returned not as your savior, but as Maxwell's partner, grown older and more dangerous with years of living under a false name. They have been communicating all along. Maxwell's trips to town were meetings with your brother, planning for this day when Diego would return with federal authority to legitimize their final theft of the silver mine. Elena forced herself to breathe, to think beyond the immediate shock of betrayal. If Maria was right, then yesterday's performance had been exactly that, a carefully orchestrated deception designed to convince her that rescue was at hand while her enemies positioned themselves for the final act of destruction. But you are not defenseless, Mia. You have something they do not know you possess. Eduardo's true survey notes, hidden where only family would think to look. These papers prove not only your father's ownership of the land, but also the exact location and extent of the silver vein. With these documents, you hold the power to destroy both Maxwell and Diego, or to claim your rightful inheritance and build the life your father dreamed for you. Alina's tears had dried now, replaced by something colder and harder. Maria's final words seemed to glow on the parchment. Trust no one completely. Love cautiously, but never surrender. You are Eduardo Blackwood's daughter and my spiritual child. You carry the strength of both bloodlines, the wisdom of silence, and the power of truth. Use these gifts well, and you will not only survive, you will triumph. Elena folded the letter carefully and returned it to its hiding place. Then, moving with new purpose, she made her way to the old well Maria had mentioned. It stood behind the house, long, dry, but deep, its stone walls disappearing into shadow. She lowered herself carefully over the rim, her feet finding handholds in the rough stone. 20 feet down, her searching fingers found the bundle Maria had described, oiled leather wrapped around what felt like rolled papers and small objects. Elena tucked the bundle inside her nightgown and climbed back to the surface, her heart pounding with exertion and anticipation. Back in the safety of Maria's house, she unwrapped her father's legacy. The papers were perfectly preserved. Detailed geological surveys in Eduardo's neat handwriting, assayers' reports confirming the purity of the silver samples, and most importantly, a map showing the exact location of the richest deposits. The silver vein ran directly beneath the land Maxwell now claimed, but it extended far beyond his stolen acreage. The richest deposits lay under property that had never been officially claimed, land that could be legally registered by anyone with the proper documentation and mining certificates. Eduardo had been more than a simple farmer. He had been a trained mining engineer with the knowledge and legal authority to claim mineral rights across thousands of acres. His murder had been not just a crime of greed, but an act of calculated economic warfare designed to steal what could have been the foundation of a mining empire. Elena studied the maps and documents until dawn painted the eastern sky pale gold. Then she carefully rewrapped the bundle and concealed it in a hiding place of her own. Sewn into the lining of Maria's old winter coat, the one garment Maxwell had never questioned her keeping as a memento. As she walked back toward the main house, Elena's mind was already planning. If Diego was truly in partnership with Maxwell, their plan likely involved leading the other federal officers into an ambush in the canyon country, eliminating witnesses, while staging the scene to support their cover story of Mexican bandits. But they had made one crucial mistake in their calculations. They had assumed Elena remained the traumatized, helpless child they had created 13 years ago. They had no idea she had spent those years learning, growing, and preparing for exactly this moment. Elena entered the kitchen just as Maxwell was emerging from his bedroom, already dressed for the day's performance. He nodded to her with distracted acknowledgement, his mind clearly focused on the elaborate deception ahead. "Coffee," he said without preamble. "The federal men will be here within the hour, and I want everything perfect for our ride to the canyon." Elena nodded and began preparing breakfast, but her enhanced hearing caught the sound of Maxwell moving through the house toward his study. She heard the distinctive creak of the floorboard that concealed his private safe, the soft click of tumblers falling into place. When Maxwell returned to the kitchen 20 minutes later, Elena noticed the bulge in his jacket pocket that hadn't been there before. A gun, most likely, though possibly documents or gold intended to plant evidence at whatever scene Maxwell planned to stage. "The weather's turning," Maxwell observed, glancing toward the windows where storm clouds were building on the horizon. "Perfect for what we need to accomplish today." Elena poured coffee with steady hands, but her mind was racing. A storm would provide cover for violence, would wash away evidence, and make it difficult for anyone to backtrack the events of the day. If the federal officers were indeed walking into an ambush, the approaching weather would be Maxwell's ally. But it could be Elena's ally too, if she was clever enough to use it. The sound of approaching horses interrupted her thoughts. Through the kitchen window, she could see 3 riders cresting the ridge, Diego and the 2 federal officers, arriving right on schedule for whatever trap awaited them. Elena watched as Maxwell composed his face into its mask of rural hospitality and stepped onto the front porch. His performance was flawless as always, warm and welcoming, the picture of a man eager to help federal authorities solve a troubling crime. "Gentlemen, right on time. I have the horses saddled and my best tracker ready to guide us." Elena positioned herself where she could observe the scene without being noticed. Diego dismounted with fluid grace, and in the morning light, she could see the family resemblance even more clearly. He had their father's hands, their mother's eyes. But Maria's letter had opened Elena's perception to details she had missed before. The way Diego's gaze moved constantly, not with the alertness of a lawman expecting danger, but with the calculated assessment of a predator evaluating terrain. The subtle signals that passed between him and Maxwell, a glance, a gesture, the positioning that spoke of long partnership rather than recent acquaintance. Most tellingly, she noticed how Diego had positioned himself so that he could see both federal officers while remaining partially behind them. It was a tactical arrangement that would allow him to act against his supposed colleagues at the optimal moment. Marshal Tucker was studying a hand-drawn map, probably one of Maxwell's fabrications designed to lead them to the predetermined ambush site. "This canyon you mentioned, how far into the wilderness are we talking?" 25 miles, Maxwell replied, his voice carrying perfect notes of concern and determination. "Remote country, but that's exactly why these bandits feel safe using it as their base. We'll need to approach carefully. If they spot us coming, they'll scatter like smoke." Diego nodded gravely. "My sources suggest they have lookouts posted along the main approaches. We'll need to use the old Apache trails, come at them from an unexpected direction." His sources. Elena's hands tightened around the coffee pot she was holding. Diego was revealing knowledge no legitimate federal officer should possess, intimate familiarity with criminal operations and terrain. The other officers didn't seem to notice the slip, but Elena filed it away as another piece of evidence. "How long will this expedition take?" Inspector Hayes asked, checking his pocket watch. "We have reports to file, and the territorial governor is expecting updates on our progress. We should be back by sunset," Maxwell assured him, "assuming we find what we're looking for." They would find exactly what Maxwell had prepared for them to find, Elena realized. Bodies positioned to support the story of Mexican bandits, evidence planted to close the case while eliminating the federal witnesses who might ask inconvenient questions later. But Elena had decided she would not let that happen. As the men prepared to mount their horses, Elena made her decision. She caught Maxwell's attention with a gentle touch on his arm, the first time she had initiated physical contact with him in years. "Sir?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Maxwell turned, surprised by her uncharacteristic assertiveness. "What is it, girl?" Elena reached into her pocket and withdrew a small piece of paper on which she had written a single word in Spanish, "Tormenta, storm." Maxwell glanced at the paper, then at the darkening sky, then back to Elena with something that might have been approval in his eyes. He thought she was warning him about the weather, offering information that might help his plans. "Good girl," he said quietly. "You're finally learning to be useful." But Elena wasn't warning him about the storm. She was telling him that a storm was coming, one that would sweep away his carefully constructed lies and leave nothing but truth in its wake. As the 4 men rode out toward the canyon country, Elena returned to the house and began her own preparations. She had hours before they returned, assuming they returned at all. Time enough to gather the evidence she had been collecting for 13 years and prepare for whatever confrontation awaited. Elena retrieved her hidden documentation and spread it across Maria's kitchen table. Maps showing the locations of Maxwell's secret meetings, sketches of faces and license plates from his midnight associates, dates cross-referenced with railroad thefts and unexplained disappearances. But now she added new elements: Eduardo's mining surveys, the proof of legal ownership, the maps showing the exact location of silver deposits worth more than Maxwell had stolen in a lifetime of crime. She had spent 13 years learning to be invisible, to observe without being seen, to document without being suspected. Now it was time to use those skills actively rather than defensively. Elena changed from her simple dress into the practical clothes Maria had taught her to prefer for difficult work: men's trousers, a cotton shirt, sturdy boots. She braided her long hair back severely and pinned it under a wide-brimmed hat that would conceal her features from a distance. From Maria's sewing kit, she retrieved items that could serve as weapons if necessary. Long needles that could punch through leather, small scissors sharp enough to cut rope or cloth, a thimble heavy enough to add force to a desperate blow. Most importantly, she gathered writing materials and several copies of the most crucial documents. If something happened to her, she wanted to ensure that the truth would survive. Elena had learned patience from 13 years of waiting, but she had also learned that patience without action was merely another form of surrender. Today, the waiting ended. As she prepared to leave the house, Elena paused before Maria's altar one final time. The Virgin of Guadalupe gazed down with eternal compassion, and Elena found herself speaking aloud for the second time in 13 years. "Ayúdame, Madre," she whispered in Spanish. "Help me find the strength to do what must be done." The storm was building on the horizon, dark clouds pregnant with rain and wind. In a few hours Maxwell would return from the canyon country. Believing his problems solved and his secrets safe, Diego would presumably return as well, his federal credentials intact and his share of the silver mine secure. But Elena Blackwood had other plans. She mounted the horse she had secretly prepared, Maria's old mare, gentle but strong, trained to respond to signals rather than voice commands. Elena had been practicing with the animal for months, knowing that someday she might need to travel far and fast without relying on anyone else for transportation. As she rode toward the canyon country, Elena felt something she had not experienced since childhood: the fierce joy of taking action rather than merely enduring. For 13 years she had been Maxwell's victim and Diego's abandoned sister. Today she would become something else entirely. Today she would become Elena Blackwood, daughter of Eduardo, heir to a silver mine, and architect of justice too long delayed. The storm clouds gathered overhead as Elena rode toward her destiny, and in the distance, thunder began to thunder like the voice of God, preparing to speak truth into a world built on lies. Behind her, smoke rose from the canyon country where 4 men played out the final act of a deception that had lasted 13 years. But ahead of her lay the future she would create with her own hands, her own courage, and her own understanding of what justice truly meant. The silent girl was gone forever. In her place rode a woman who knew exactly what she was worth, and exactly what price her enemies would pay for underestimating her. Elena Blackwood was going to war, and this time she intended to win. The canyon country stretched before Elena like a wound carved into the earth, its red walls bleeding rust-colored shadows across stone floors polished smooth by centuries of wind and rain. She had ridden hard for 3 hours, following trails her father had once shown her when she was small enough to sit before him on his saddle, listening to his stories about the Apache who had called this place sacred. The storm clouds hung low now, so heavy with moisture that Elena could taste electricity on her tongue. Lightning flickered in the distance, still silent but growing closer with each flash. Perfect weather for the kind of violence Maxwell and Diego had planned, but also perfect cover for what Elena intended to do. She dismounted at the entrance to Spider Canyon, the narrow gorge Maxwell would use to funnel his victims into the killing ground he had prepared. Elena had spent years studying his patterns, learning to read the signs of his preparations. He was a creature of habit, and habits could be predicted. Maria's mare nickered softly, sensing the approaching storm. Elena stroked the animal's neck and whispered reassurances in Spanish before hobbling her in a sheltered alcove where she would be safe from flash floods. From here, Elena would proceed on foot, moving with the silent precision Maria had taught her when they gathered medicinal herbs in dangerous places. The canyon floor showed recent disturbance: boot prints in the sand, the circular marks left by horses tied to scrub brush, the blackened remains of a small fire. Maxwell's advance team had been here, preparing the scene for whatever performance they intended to stage for the federal officers. Elena followed the trail deeper into the canyon, her enhanced senses cataloging every detail: the acrid smell of gunpowder lingering in the air, dark stains on stone that could be old blood, and something else: the sweet, sick scent of decay, suggesting that bodies had been placed and removed from this location recently. As she rounded a bend in the canyon wall, Elena heard voices carried on the wind. Male voices, speaking in low tones with the careful cadence of men discussing violence. She pressed herself against the stone and edged forward until she could see the scene Maxwell had constructed. A natural amphitheater opened before her, its walls rising on three sides like the seats of some ancient colosseum. At the center, 4 horses stood tied to a dead cottonwood, but only 3 riders remained visible. Maxwell paced near a pile of rocks that looked suspiciously like grave markers, while Diego stood with his back to Elena, his posture tense with anticipation. The 2 federal officers sat on stones near what appeared to be the remains of a camp. Blankets scattered carelessly, cooking pots overturned, the kind of debris that might be left by bandits fleeing in haste. But Elena's trained eye could see the careful arrangement, the way each detail had been positioned to support Maxwell's narrative. "Where's the 4th man?" Marshal Tucker was asking, his voice carrying clearly in the canyon's acoustics. "Posted as lookout," Maxwell replied smoothly. "Can't be too careful in country like this. These bandits are clever. They'll have escape routes planned." Elena scanned the canyon rim until she spotted him. A figure with a rifle positioned on the high ground, commanding a clear view of the amphitheater below. Not a lookout watching for bandits, but a sniper prepared to eliminate witnesses once Maxwell gave the signal. "I don't see any fresh signs," Inspector Hayes said, kneeling to examine the staged campsite. "This debris looks old, weathered. Are you certain your information about recent activity is accurate?" Elena saw Diego and Maxwell exchange a glance. Their careful timeline was being questioned by men with more field experience than they had anticipated. "Bandits are careful about covering their tracks," Diego said, his voice carrying the authority of his federal credentials. "But if you know what to look for," he moved toward a section of the canyon wall where Elena could see fresh scratches in the stone, marks that had obviously been made with metal tools rather than worn by natural weathering. "Apache pictographs," Diego announced, pointing to the scratches. "Recent ones based on the color of the exposed stone. The local tribes sometimes work with the Mexican bandits, providing information about railroad schedules in exchange for a share of the profits." Elena's heart clenched. Diego was desecrating Apache sacred symbols, using her father's people's heritage as a prop in his deception. The casual racism of it, the way he reduced ancient spiritual traditions to criminal conspiracy, revealed the depth of his corruption. But his explanation was working. Elena could see the federal officers leaning forward, their skepticism giving way to interest as Diego spun his web of lies with the expertise of 13 years' practice. "What do these symbols mean?" Marshal Tucker asked. "Warning markers," Maxwell interjected, moving to stand beside Diego in a display of partnership. "The Apache are telling other tribes to stay away from this area while the bandits are using it as a base." More lies, delivered with the smooth confidence of men who had perfected their story through repetition. But Elena noticed details the federal officers missed: the way Maxwell's hand rested near his gun, the nervous energy in his movements that suggested he was preparing to act. Thunder rumbled overhead, and the first drops of rain began to fall. Large, warm drops that struck the canyon floor like bullets, each impact raising a small puff of dust. "We should head back," Inspector Hayes said, glancing up at the darkening sky. "This looks like it could turn into a real downpour." "Not yet," Diego said quickly. "We're close to something important here. Look at this." He moved toward the pile of rocks Elena had noticed earlier, and now she could see what Maxwell had prepared. As Diego began moving stones aside, the edge of a wooden box became visible, planted evidence that would support whatever story they intended to tell. "Careful," Maxwell warned, his voice tight with fake concern. "Could be booby-trapped." But Diego continued uncovering the box with the confidence of a man who knew exactly what he would find inside. When he opened the lid, even Elena could see the glint of silver coins and what appeared to be railroad company scrip, stolen payroll money, positioned to implicate the mythical Mexican bandits. "Jesus," Marshal Tucker breathed. "This is it. This is the evidence we've been looking for." Elena watched the federal officers crowd around the planted evidence, their attention completely focused on Diego's performance. She saw Maxwell's hand move to his gun, saw the sniper on the canyon rim shift his position for a better angle. The trap was closing, but Elena had her own trap prepared. She reached into her saddlebag and withdrew the bundle of documents she had brought from Maria's house. Not all of them, for she was too wise to risk everything in a single gamble, but enough to destroy Maxwell and Diego's credibility if properly presented. Elena had learned patience, but she had also learned timing, and the moment had come to act. She stepped out from behind the stone outcropping, her appearance so sudden and unexpected that all 4 men froze in surprise. "Gentlemen," Elena said, her voice carrying clearly across the amphitheater, the first time she had spoken at full volume in 13 years. "You're being deceived." The words felt strange on her lips, but also powerful. For 13 years her silence had been Maxwell's weapon against her. Now her voice would be her weapon against him. Maxwell's face went pale, then flushed red with rage. "Elena, what the hell are you doing here? Get back to the house before you murder these federal officers the way you murdered my father," Elena interrupted, stepping further into the amphitheater. "Before you stage another scene to cover your crimes?" Diego's hand moved toward his gun, but Elena had anticipated this. She held up a bundle of papers, clearly visible to all 4 men. "I have Eduardo Blackwood's original mining surveys," she announced. "Legal documentation proving this land belongs to my family, not to Maxwell Holden. And I have witness statements describing how my father was killed 13 years ago by the man you trust as your guide." Marshal Tucker straightened, his lawman's instincts finally awakening to the danger. "Miss, what are you saying? This man reported your father's death as—" "A lie," Elena said firmly. "Everything Maxwell has told you is a lie. There are no Mexican bandits using this canyon. The railroad robberies are being committed by Maxwell and his hired men, including the brother who betrayed my father for 30 pieces of silver." She looked directly at Diego, saw recognition and guilt warring in his eyes. "Yes, Diego, I know who you are. I know what you did. And I know you've been Maxwell's partner all these years, not his victim." The silence that followed was broken only by the increasing tempo of raindrops striking stone. Elena could see the federal officers processing what she had said, their minds working to reconcile her accusations with the evidence they thought they had found. Inspector Hayes was the first to speak. "These are serious allegations, miss. Do you have proof of what you're claiming?" Elena held up the bundle of documents. "Eduardo Blackwood's geological surveys, proving the existence of silver deposits on this land, his mining certificates issued by the territorial government, the deed to the property Maxwell stole, and most importantly, a witness statement written by Maria Esperanza before her death, describing how she saw Diego meeting secretly with Maxwell in the weeks before my father's murder." Maxwell's composure finally cracked. "You little bitch," he snarled, his hand moving openly to his weapon. 13 years I've fed and housed you, and this is how you repay me?" But his movement was the signal Elena had been waiting for. As Maxwell drew his gun, she threw herself to the side and shouted a single word in Spanish. "Ahora?" The sniper on the canyon rim had been focused on the federal officers, waiting for Maxwell's signal to begin the massacre. He hadn't noticed the Apache warriors, who had been moving into position along the canyon walls, summoned by the smoke signals Elena had arranged during her ride from the ranch. Elena had learned many things during her years of forced silence, including the fact that her father had not been the only victim of Maxwell's greed. The Apache families who had once worked his land, the Mexican farmers whose water rights had been stolen, the railroad workers who had discovered his crimes, all had reasons to want justice, and Elena had spent months learning to communicate with the survivors, using the pictographic symbols Diego had just finished desecrating with his lies. The Apache warriors struck with precision born of generations of guerrilla warfare. The sniper on the canyon rim died silently, his rifle sliding down the rock face to shatter on the stones below. Maxwell's other hidden men, positioned at the canyon's exits to prevent escape, found themselves facing opponents who knew every inch of this sacred ground. In the amphitheater below, chaos erupted. Maxwell fired wildly at Elena, his shots going wide as she rolled behind the cover of the staged campsite. Diego drew his own weapon, but found himself facing Marshal Tucker's gun as the federal officer finally understood the true nature of the situation. "Drop it," Tucker demanded. "Both of you, weapons down. You don't understand," Diego protested, his voice taking on the wheedling tone of a man accustomed to talking his way out of trouble. "The girl is delusional, traumatized by her father's death. She's been living in fantasy for years." His words were cut off by Inspector Hayes, who had been examining the documents Elena had brought. "These mining certificates are genuine," he announced. "Signed and sealed by the Territorial Mining Authority, and this survey work is professional grade, not the product of a delusional mind." Elena rose from behind her cover, keeping low but moving with purpose toward the cache of planted evidence Diego had uncovered. As she reached the wooden box, she grabbed a handful of the silver coins and held them up to the light. "Look at the dates," she called out. "These coins weren't minted until 1881, 2 years after the first railroad robbery you're investigating. Maxwell planted this evidence to support his story, but he was careless with the details." The federal officers exchanged glances, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Maxwell saw his carefully constructed narrative collapsing and made a desperate choice. Instead of surrender, he turned his gun toward Diego. "This is your fault," Maxwell snarled at his partner. "If you had killed her 13 years ago like you were supposed to." The gunshot that cut off his words came not from Maxwell's weapon, but from Diego's. Elena watched in shock as Maxwell collapsed, clutching his chest, his face a mask of surprise and betrayal. "He's right," Diego said quietly, his gun now pointed at the federal officers. "I should have killed her years ago, but I can still correct that mistake." Elena saw the madness in her brother's eyes, the desperate calculation of a man with nothing left to lose. He had betrayed everyone who had ever trusted him, his father, his sister, his federal colleagues, and now his criminal partner. There was nowhere left for him to run except deeper into darkness. But Elena had one final card to play. "You can't kill all of us, Diego," she said calmly. "And even if you do, it won't matter. I sent copies of all the evidence to 3 different newspapers before I left the ranch this morning. By tomorrow, everyone in Texas will know the truth about what happened here. It was a lie, but a convincing one." Elena had learned from Maxwell the power of careful deception, the way truth and falsehood could be woven together to create an irresistible narrative. Diego's gun wavered as he processed this information. "You're lying. You've been mute for 13 years. You don't have the connections or the knowledge to." "I had 13 years to plan," Elena interrupted. 13 years to learn, to prepare, to build relationships with people who believed in justice. Did you think I spent all that time doing nothing?" Thunder crashed overhead, and rain began falling in earnest, turning the canyon floor into a maze of puddles and flowing streams. The sound of Apache war cries echoed from the canyon walls as the survivors of Maxwell's other crimes began their own reckoning. Inspector Hayes had been quietly maneuvering during the confrontation, and now he struck, tackling Diego from behind and sending his gun skittering across the wet stone. The 2 men struggled briefly before Marshal Tucker joined the fight, using his badge and authority to subdue the rogue federal officer. Elena knelt beside Maxwell, who was dying slowly from Diego's bullet. His eyes found hers, and for the first time in 13 years she saw something other than calculation in his gaze. "The silver," he whispered, blood frothing at his lips. You know where it is." "The mine, yes," Elena said softly. "I know exactly where it is, and I know exactly what I'm going to do with it." Maxwell's eyes widened, perhaps finally understanding the magnitude of what he had lost through his greed and violence. What will you do?" Elena leaned closer, her voice gentle despite everything he had done to her. "I'm going to use it to build the life my father dreamed of. Schools for Apache children. Hospitals for the workers your robberies left widowed and orphaned. Justice for everyone you hurt." "No," Maxwell gasped. "The money, it's mine." "I earned it. You stole it," Elena corrected. "All of it. But the theft ends today." Maxwell's breathing grew shallow, his eyes losing focus. With his final breath he whispered a single word: "Deserved." Elena wasn't sure if he meant that he deserved to die or that she deserved the inheritance he had tried to steal. Perhaps both. Perhaps neither. It no longer mattered. She stood and turned to face the federal officers who were binding Diego with rope from his own saddle. Inspector Hayes approached her with the careful respect due to a woman who had just overturned 13 years of carefully constructed lies. "Miss Blackwood," he said formally, "we'll need you to make a full statement about everything you've witnessed and documented, and we'll need to examine all the evidence you've gathered." Of course, Elena replied. But first, there are others who deserve justice. Apache families who lost their land, Mexican farmers whose water rights were stolen, railroad workers whose friends died in staged robberies. They all have stories that need to be heard. Marshal Tucker nodded grimly. This is going to be a long investigation. The corruption appears to go back years, possibly decades. 13 years, 4 months, and 6 days, Elena said with the precision of someone who had been counting. Since the day Maxwell Holden murdered my father and stole our land. The rain was falling harder now, washing away the staged evidence and the blood that had been spilled in the name of truth. Elena looked up at the canyon rim where Apache warriors stood silhouetted against the stormy sky, descendants of the people who had called this place sacred, bearing witness to the justice that had finally been served. As the federal officers prepared Diego for transport back to town, Elena walked to where the wooden box of planted evidence sat abandoned in the rain. She picked up one of the silver coins Maxwell had used in his deception and held it up to examine the craftsmanship. Real silver, probably mined from the very deposits her father had discovered. The irony was almost poetic. Maxwell had used the fruits of his theft to manufacture evidence of his innocence, not knowing that his victim's daughter understood the true value of what he had stolen. Elena pocketed the coin and walked back toward where she had left Maria's mare. The storm was intensifying, but she knew the way home even in darkness and rain. She had traveled these paths her entire life, first as a child learning the land's secrets, then as a prisoner mapping every detail of her cage, and finally as a free woman reclaiming her birthright. As she mounted her horse, Elena heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see Inspector Hayes approaching, his hat in his hands despite the rain. "Miss Blackwood," he said, his voice carrying formal respect. "There's something else. Diego had this in his pocket when we searched him." He held out a small object, a wooden horse, carved with the same careful attention to detail that had marked all of Eduardo Blackwood's work. Elena recognized it immediately as one of the toys her father had made for her before his death. "He kept it," she whispered, taking the carving with trembling hands. "All these years he kept it." "People are complex," Inspector Hayes said gently. "Even those who do evil things sometimes carry pieces of the good they once were." Elena nodded, understanding the truth of his words. Diego had betrayed their father and abandoned his sister, but he had also carried this single piece of their shared childhood through 13 years of guilt and deception. It didn't excuse what he had done, but it proved that some part of the boy she had loved had survived inside the man he had become. "What will happen to him?" she asked. "Federal prison, most likely. Life sentence, given the scope of the crimes and the number of people who died because of his actions." Inspector Hayes paused, then added more quietly, "I'm sorry. I know he was your brother." "He was," Elena agreed. "But my brother died 13 years ago, the same day as my father. The man you arrested today was someone else entirely." She tucked the wooden horse into her pocket next to the silver coin, 2 tokens of a past that was finally being laid to rest. Then she gathered the reins and prepared to ride toward whatever future awaited her. "Miss Blackwood," Marshal Tucker called from where he was securing Diego to his horse for transport, "we'll need you to come to town tomorrow to make your formal statement, and there will be paperwork regarding the land claims, the mining rights. I'll be there," Elena promised. "But tonight I have other obligations." She rode toward the canyon entrance, leaving the federal officers to their prisoner and their evidence behind her. Lightning illuminated the scene one final time, the amphitheater where justice had finally been served, the blood soaking into sacred ground, the Apache warriors beginning their own ceremonies for the dead. But Elena was thinking of the future now rather than the past. Tomorrow, she would begin the legal process of reclaiming her father's land and the silver mine that lay beneath it. She would use that wealth to build the schools and hospitals she had promised Maxwell, to create something good from the evil he had done. More importantly, she would use her voice, silent for 13 years but now stronger than ever, to speak for those who had no voice of their own. The dispossessed, the murdered, the forgotten victims of men like Maxwell Holden. As she rode through the storm toward home, Elena began to sing. It was a Spanish lullaby Maria had taught her, a song about birds learning to fly after their cages had been broken. Her voice was rusty from disuse, but it grew stronger with each verse, carrying across the canyon country like a promise of better days to come. The storm raged around her, but Elena was no longer afraid of storms. She had weathered the worst life could offer and emerged not just intact, but transformed. The silent girl was gone forever, replaced by a woman who understood the true meaning of justice, the real value of family, and the immeasurable power of finding one's voice. Elena Blackwood was going home to claim her inheritance, and she was going to use it to change the world. The thunder followed her across the Texas landscape, and somewhere in its rolling voice she could hear her father's approval and Maria's blessing, carried on the wind like a prayer finally answered. Justice had been served, truth had been spoken, and the future stretched ahead like an unwritten page, ready to be filled with the stories Elena would tell and the changes she would make. For the first time in 13 years, Elena Blackwood was truly free.